Okay, hi guys, and welcome to the Poker Strategy Fixed Limit Coaching for Advanced Members. This is That's My Name. Today we're going to examine small blind open raising strategy. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, just write them into the coaching player. Afterward, I'll have an opportunity to answer any questions that you guys might have. So this content is best suited for low stakes players and really anyone with a keen interest in poker theory. Um, During the coaching, we'll spend some time reviewing concepts that I've presented before, um, and these ideas will give us kind of a solid foundation to develop on. That said, small blind open raising creates some unique challenges, and we'll need a strategy for dealing with these. Once we've identified these challenges, we'll need to calculate the expected value of an open raise, and then we can manipulate our expected value calculation to get the minimum equity required to profitably steal from the small blind. Last, we'll consider some examples, adjust for the rake and our position, and finally, we'll join some live games and put some of these ideas into practice. So, to introduce this week's topic, I'd like to review some of the material from our discussion last month on big blind defense strategy. When facing an open raise from the small blind, first we calculate our required equity by dividing our average cost to play the hand by the expected pot size. All things being equal, our required equity to play the hand does not depend on our opponent's open raising range. Only our estimated equity was subject to change. When it comes to looking at small blind open raising strategy, this is no longer true. Even if we look at the pre-flop betting stages independent of anything that goes on post-flop, our required equity to open raise is not constant. Let's consider an example. Let's say we consider our big blind defense strategy, right? Imagine a scenario where our opponent only plays aces. Well, if we needed 35% equity to open raise from the small blind, then we would need to fold pocket kings and everything worse, right? If our opponent is playing less than 1% of hands, then we should probably play a lot more. And yet our big blind defense strategy would have us also playing less than 1% of hands, just pocket aces, right? So of course, we have an added incentive to raise because this gives our opponent the option to fold. And when he folds, we win the blinds. If, in our example, say we choose to never fold, right? On average, our open raise would return an immediate profit of roughly 1.49 small bets. And this would be extremely profitable for us, right? Even if we had zero chance of winning, when we're called, right, when he plays his aces, we're gaining nearly a 200% return on our investment. If our opponent only plays aces, then we don't need 35% equity. In fact, if our opponent folds this often, we don't need any equity to raise for profit. So to reiterate, when our opponent folds, this wins us money. For this reason, our required equity to open raise from the small blind depends on the probability that our opponent continues when faced with our raise, right? In other words, it depends on how often he folds. So while big blind defense strategy gives us a simple method for deciding when to continue to the flop, right? This method does not provide us with a valid strategy for open raising. If we want to calculate required equity for open raising from the small blind, we also need to account for those times when our opponent folds. So let's think a little further about our new situation. When we're deciding whether or not to attempt to steal, well, we know we should raise with our strong hands. And with our weaker hands, the situation is less clear, and we might fold, but we still need to know how to make this decision, right? And what we do know is that if our opponent folds too much, then we should raise more. If our opponent never folds when faced with our raise, then we want to have stronger equity against them because we know we're going to play the pot. In other words, the chance that we win the blinds right away is zero if our opponent never folds. So let's say our cost to raise changes. If it's more expensive for us to steal the blinds, then we need to raise less often and with stronger hands. The reward for stealing is less valuable. However, if the reward for stealing increases, then again we should raise more often. These changes happen, especially when the blind structure changes or, say, an ante is introduced. As we'll see later on, even small changes can have big consequences. So with this notion in mind, our task is to create a simple method for calculating the equity that we need in order to open raise against an opponent who defends their blind with any frequency. And to do that, let's start off by calculating the expected value of an open raise. The expected value is a random variable, and it's equal to the sum of all possible events multiplied by the probability of each one. In its simplest form, it looks like the equation you see here. We have expected value equal to the sum of the probability of event n times the payoff, xn, right? So what we do is we take each thing that can happen, right? We multiply it by the probability that it does happen, and we add all those things up, and the result is our expected value. So what we need to do is define each payoff and then determine the probability of each of these payoffs, right? One payoff would be when we raise and win the blinds, right? Another would be when we play the hand and lose, right? Here, our payoff is the loss of our investment in the hand. A third payoff would be when we play the hand and win the pot, right? If we simplify and use average pot sizes and average investments, then we can look at pre-flop play independent of a wide range of things that happen post-flop. So using our simplified model, we create this equation, and our expected value here is equal to the probability that our opponent folds, right? P fold times the blinds. And to that, we add the probability that our opponent continues in the hand multiplied by the expected value of playing the hand, right? So all of this in here, this is the expected value of playing the hand. And again, we're calculating by adding up the things that can happen multiplied by the probability that they happen. So in other words, our expected value to play the hand is equal to the amount that we win multiplied by our probability of winning the hand, right? Minus our investment, which we would lose, times the probability of losing the hand, right? So this is our expected value calculation. It's simplified, right? But nevertheless, very useful. So let's stop and think for a minute. Our probability of winning the hand against our opponent's hand range, that's basically our equity, right? Also, we know that whenever our expected value is greater than 0, then we can play for value. So to calculate the minimum equity required to raise, we can set the expected value to 0 and then solve for required equity. So we have our equation, right? P fold times the blinds multiplied by our expected value when we play the hand, right? And we can solve this equation for our required equity, REQ. And when we do that, we get this equation here, right? And this becomes very useful for us because it allows us to calculate how much equity that we need to steal. So at this point, we know that the average pot size and the probability our opponent, at this point, if we know the average pot size and the probability our opponent folds, we can make adjustments to exploit their mistakes. However, there's some other factors that we may want to consider. When we're out of position, this costs us. It's a significant disadvantage. And when we're open raising from the small blind, we are out of position. So let's consider the situation where we are in position, right? We get to act after our opponent. And all things being equal, if we know something more than our opponent can know, right, we can use that to make better decisions about when to check or bet or raise or fold, right? And this wins us more money. So if we refer once again to our discussion from big blind defense strategy, I said that position gives us a roughly 4 big bet per 100 advantage, right? With an average pot size of say 4.5 big bets, right? We're wagering 450 big bets per 100 hands on average. So if position gives us a roughly 4 big bets per 100 edge, right? This roughly translates to about 1% of all the money being wagered, right? So this 1% of the money that our opponent stands to win by having position on us, it doesn't simply come out of thin air, right? It comes from us. So when we're in the small blind, we need to increase our average investment by the money that our opponent stands to win. We need to increase our average investment by 1% of all the money being wagered per hand. So we also have to pay the rake, right? From limits 1, 2 to 5, 10, I think it's roughly 3% of the pot goes to the poker room. There may be some small changes in there. So any pot that we could stand to win, these all need to be discounted by the rake, in this case 3%. And when we do these things, when we increase our investment by 1% of the pot, decrease our winnings by 3% of the pot, the net effect is that our required equity increases. So the rake and position drive up our required equity, and this cuts down on the maximum edge we're willing to give our opponent. If I put this another way, we can give our opponent as large of an equity, or we can't, sorry, give our opponent as large of an equity advantage when they have position and when we account for the rake, because it makes it more expensive and less rewarding for us to continue. So let's say our opponent folds 45% of the time, right? And let's also estimate again that the average pot size is 4.5 big bets. Well, the question becomes, how much equity do we need to raise profitably, right? So we have our example here. When we fill in each variable and calculate an output for our required equity, we will see that the required equity to raise is roughly 30%. And this is accounting for the rake as well, and position, which this equation does not have as a factor. I put it this way just to keep things a little bit more simple. So once we know our required equity, this 30%, next we need to put our opponent on a range of hands. And we know that our opponent is going to continue 55% of the time, but the question is, which 55% of hands is our opponent going to play? Well, one simple way to assign a hand range is to be charitable to our opponent and assume that they're playing the strongest 55% of hands. And using a program like Equilab, we can calculate a range of hands with greater than 30% equity, and the result here would be every hand that we could raise for profit against our opponent's range. So we'll be able to do some of those calculations in a moment. And what I think you guys will see is that you might end up being kind of surprised by the number of hands that can be profitably stealed when our opponent is folding 45% of the time. But before we get to that, I need to state a few assumptions. These assumptions are important because without them, then it's not very easy for us to use a model to estimate how much equity we need to play, right? So the assumptions that I've made here so far are that both players are equally skilled. Now this one would be pretty easy to account for, right? Let's say our opponent is more skilled than we are, right? And let's say he figures to win 2% more of the money that is wagered post-flop, right? Then that would be kind of like the way we account for our position, right? So it'd be a relatively simple adjustment. The second assumption here, gradually more problematic, is that the average pot size accounts for situations when more action goes in pre-flop. So let's say we get 3-bet, right? Well, in situations where we get 3-bet, the average pot size is going to go up, right? It didn't go up relative to our decision to play the hand pre-flop, right? But it's going to go up now, right? But basically what we're saying here is anytime our attempt to steal fails, right, whenever it doesn't work, then we're going to be playing for the average pot. And you know, 3-bet pots are going to be included with that. Third is that this calculation implies that the chance we pay the rake is directly related to our equity in the pot. And this assumption is somewhat questionable. When we win the pot without a showdown, our stronger hands typically lose value, and our weaker hands typically increase in value. So in reality, the chance that we pay the rake is not just related to our hand's equity against our opponent's hand range, it's also going to be related to our hand range is equity against our opponent's range. Um, Conceptually, to kind of counter this, when our opponent induces us to fold, we're going to tend to fold the weaker hands more often than the stronger ones, which again, makes this adjustment relatively, it's kind of reasonable. So the last one, and in my opinion, this is the most problematic, is that I've assumed that each hand that we play will play for an average pot, right? So in reality, our strongest hands will play bigger pots, right? Especially when they run into another strong hand. And our weaker hands will generally play smaller pots. The net effect of this is that actually, we're going to be playing a little bit tighter than we should, because we're assuming these weaker hands are going to be paying more than they probably will. So to summarize, today we've taken kind of a closer look at small blind open raising strategy. And what we can see is that one way to justify a raise fold decision is to calculate our required equity. Required equity, as we've calculated it today, is an attempt on our part to determine what chance we need to win a hand in the event that our steal attempt fails, right? This calculation includes our opponent's probability of folding, the average pot size, but we're also interested in other factors, right? Like the rake and position, and also the betting structure, which we'll take a closer look at in a moment. Finally, I've made some assumptions in creating this model. Accounting for these would be nice, but what we can see is for sure is that there's going to be a lot of room for improvement and also for discussion. So let's close that up. And ideally, if we're going to look at examples, it would be nice to run a lot of calculations, right? Possibly hundreds of them. And this would take a lot of time. So instead, using Microsoft Excel, I've created a spreadsheet that does some of this for us, right? And the kinds of things that I want to ask here are what happens if we change something, right? What happens if the rake changes, right? What happens if the advantage we give someone by having position changes? What about if the small blind or the average pot size changes, right? Which of these factors has the largest effect on our required equity? And, our ideas about small change aren't always clear. So, let's just look at the next higher or the next smaller thing, right? So let's start with the small blind. Well, we can see here our minimum required equity is roughly 30%, right? We have this scenario where our opponent folds 45% of the time, plays 55%. We have the rake and position factored and the average pot size here. So in a 1 to 2 blind structure, it's 30%. But let's say we were playing at 3-6, right? Well, at 3-6, we're looking at a 1 to 3 blind structure. The big blind is $3, right? And the small blind is $1. So let's make this equal to 1 divided by 3. We'll make it 1/3 of the big blind. And what we see is that our required equity has increased by about 2.5%, right? And what if you watch this line, you'll see it gradually adjust for the amount of equity. So if I were to explain this graphic kind of simply, right? The blue line is the probability that our opponent folds, and the red line is the required equity that we need to open raise. Just one moment. Okay, so when we change this, right, it's having about a 2.5% effect on our required equity. So let's do this calculation. We know that our opponent is going to be playing 55% of hands, right? And we want to calculate a hand range that has either 30% or 32.4, 32.5%. So let's do 30, right? This is when we're looking at a 1 to 2 blind structure. And we pull up this hand range. And what we see is that it's basically a random hand, right? The only hand that may be worth folding is 7 deuce offsuit, right? If our opponent is folding 45% of the time, we're getting a lot of value by open raising widely. So let's change the situation. We're in a 1 to 3 blind structure now. How much equity do we need in this situation? So, oh, that's not going to be right. 3.25 is not correct. There we go. So of course this is going to change our hand range, right? We're folding more often. And the reason, as I pointed out during the presentation, is because our cost to steal has increased, right? So we need to fold a little less often or continue with slightly stronger hands. Now, the question I'm wondering about is, let's say we go back to point 5, right? How much would we need to change something else in order to get the same effect? Well, if we say this is 50 cent a dollar, right? Well, by decreasing to 1 to 3 blind structure, we have decreased the size of the small blind by, what, 17 cents, right? Pretty small amount. Well, how much would we have to increase the average pot size to have the same effect? So let's go not 4.5, let's make it 5. And we're still not quite there, right? We've just increased the average pot size by a dollar, right? A whole dollar. And it's still not having the same effect as changing the small blind by just 17 cents. So I think it's going to be roughly, I mean, it doesn't really matter to get it exact, but it's going to be something in between there, right? It's not going to be 5. So let's look at the rake percentage. How much would we have to drive up the cost of the rake in order to have the same effect? We can see that increasing the average pot size by about, you know, a half a bet, right, gets the same effect. It's pretty close to that. But let's increase the rake. So let's go to 5%. We can see that's not enough. It only increased by about 0.7, right? Let's go to 10%. Okay, now we're getting close, right? 11, 10.5% would do it, right? So we would need to increase the rake by 7.5% just to have the same effect that decreasing the small blind by 17 cents would have, right? So small change, right? Relatively larger change, right? Same effect. Oops, there we go. The position is going to be very similar to that. Let's make it 8%. See if that does it. Okay, well, position a little more significant than we thought. Let's make it 5. Okay, so, you know, basically what we're seeing here is that regardless of how we change these values, um, our our minimum equity required to play the hand is changing constantly, right? So it's really important that we have a dynamic strategy for looking at that. Oh, if position gives him a 100% advantage, then we can see that we need a lot of equity to open raise, almost no matter how often he folds. So that's important. Okay, but there's something else that's worth pointing out. Our graph here shows a large portion of the time when we don't even need equity, right? It looks to be about, you know, up to roughly 68% of the time that our opponent folds. So let's give our opponent a 22% hand range. Would that be right? 22. Okay, let's increase it a little bit. 25. Nope, that's not right. 30. Okay, now we're getting close. There it is. Okay, so until our opponent is defending his big blind more than 72% of the time, we don't need any equity to open raise against them. But there's another problem because we're always going to have some equity when we open raise. Like even 7-2 offsuit against aces still has some chance of winning, right? So our next question becomes, well, how much would he have to be defending his blind in order for our weakest hands to not even be worth playing? And we saw that when he was playing 55% of the time, we got quite close, right? So let's decrease that just a little bit. We'll go to 53, make it the probability that our opponent folds being 47% of the time. So this was his 55% range. We'll make it 53. And we have the probability that he folds, giving us our minimum equity. So we put in 28.7. And I think this is going to give us a random hand. There it is. So what we can see is that until our opponent is defending roughly half the time, we have no incentive to fold. In fact, we should open raise all the time. So that's pretty much the presentation that I have for you guys today. Obviously, there's a lot of different simulations we can run here, right? We could look at, you know, how often the big blind should defend, how often we want to open raise given that, and start to solve for some kind of a optimal play, right? Which would be very interesting as well. But let's just throw ourselves into some live play, and we'll take a look at different scenarios. So I'll just need a minute here to prepare for that, close a few things up. And like I said before, if you guys have any questions, now is an excellent opportunity to get those in. Okay, I'll probably need Equilab. And I'm just going to join a couple tables, and we'll put this stuff right into practice. Okay, so we have our first hand, ace-jack offsuit with the button open and a small blind 3-bet. I'm going to cap here. Um, I don't know either player, so I think probably just standard play is going to be best. And I know this button, he's open, sorry, I know this player at least. He's open raising pretty widely in this situation. The small blind, I'm just going to assume that he's also open raising pretty wide. This turn card is quite good for me. Both players have just called. Unless they have a 6, which they'd probably flat on the flop, I'm likely ahead here. And I may even be able to value bet the river. If we assume that this player is continuing wide. So on the river, I have ace, queen, jack with a pair of 6s. I'm going to value bet my ace high and see if he decides to make a loose call. So king 2 offsuit, I'll fold there. And this is also important for us, right? We could say that it's not terribly likely that our opponent would play a worse hand than ours more passively. So if he had like some kind of a pair, maybe he's going to put in action at some point, right? So we can be pretty confident that we're ahead on the river. What's going on here? I guess I defended my blind. He's c-betting the flop. I'm going to peel with queen high. Relatively dry board texture. We could be ahead. King on the river is good for us. When he checks back, he could have had a gut shot. Hopefully not a gut shot with a king, which is possible. But I'm going to play check call river and induce a bluff. Instead, he decided to check back 2 pair, which is interesting. Okay. Tavi says I should fold river there. Yeah, it's possible. I know this guy to be kind of fishy, and I didn't really take the time to look at my notes, and that might help us. I can see he checked back the turn and then bluff raised the river to fold to a 3-bet. So he is capable of checking back and bluffing. Um, and I don't have a hole card hand for that, so that's kind of a useless note. Could probably get rid of that. Yeah, I was getting like 3 to 1 or whatever. So in that case, getting 3 to 1, I need to be ahead 25% of the time. So, we need to think about his button open raising range, right? We're heads up. So, like I said, on the turn, he could pick up a lot of draws and decide to check with them. Any 2 or 4 or, any kind of 6, 7 type hand, right, with the gut shot there. And I'm still ahead of all those hands. And actually, I don't even have blockers against them, right? With my queen high, it's not like my 8 is stealing any of those combos. Also the flush, right? So he has all his flush combinations too. So I think it's kind of close. But I do tend to call down a lot, and it's still an area that I'm working on myself. So folding might turn out to be the best option. Okay, 7-3 offsuit against a raise. I'm going to fold here. Now, of course, when blind versus blind situations come up, we will be kind of looking at these concepts and trying to estimate how much equity we need to steal and also how much we're going to have against our opponent's range. But, of course, I'll be covering other material during the live play session. Queen 6, definitely going to be a steal attempt if it folds around to us. With the call, this is actually kind of marginal. I'm going to fold here, but once I get a good handle on these players, sometimes we can justify continuing pretty light in those spots. Okay. Ace-8 offsuit, definitely going to be playing this, I think. Okay, maybe not. From the early position, when this guy open raises, usually players at these stakes are raising like between 15 and 18% of the time, sometimes even a little less. And against that hand range, ace-8 offsuit is not going to fare that well. Um, I would expect to have maybe 39% equity against a 15% hand range. And we can check that pretty quickly, actually. Of course, we can make changes to that open raising range as well and say that maybe he's raising some different types of hands. 41. So yeah, roughly. And to isolate 3-bet, we would need roughly 48% equity against him. Back on that hand where I called with queen high, yeah, his turn check back can definitely be a king. You know, that would make sense for a thinking player. I know that player to be loose and kind of spazzy and, you know, just generally kind of a fishy player. And of course, you know, they're going to have some more randomness in the way that they play their hands. So I've raised pre-flop with king queen. With 10-7, I defended my blind and I've hit top pair. Good at check raise here. Lots of draws on this board. You know, gut shots and straight draws. The 6 on the turn means that we're not likely to get too much action from worse hands. And he decides to raise. Now at this point, he can bluff, and I think that it's going to be too often for me to justify folding. So I'm going to call, and on the river we're chopping a lot, so I'm going to call again. Queen Jack, I'm going to raise though. And ace 10, I'll 3-bet here. Although this guy's pretty tight, so we have to be aware that we could be up against some strong hands. This Queen Jack hand has kind of played itself. I raised from out of position, bet top pair, barreled the turn, improved to a flush on the river, so I'm going to barrel there too. And I guess this guy 4-bet. Yep. So I'm going to peel once here. It's quite close though because we don't really have a strong draw. Queen 6 offsuit on the button, I'm going to fold. On the turn, I'm going to raise. There's a lot of draws on the board. He's probably going to barrel if he has queens or whatever. If he has an ace, he's probably ahead of us. It's interesting to see that he would give me enough credit to fold there. On this river, some straights came in, but I'm still going to value bet, and we'll see what happens. But I do want to take a note that he is giving me a lot of credit. Okay. And this guy, slow playing 2-pair, take a note of that. King 10 suited, we can raise. And with top pair, we'll just keep barreling. Ten deuce, standard fold there. Queen 7, standard fold against the raise. However, this player in the big blind does appear to be somewhat tight. We might guess that he's defending about half the time. And what we've seen from our analysis of small blind open raising strategy, we should definitely raise a hand like Queen 7, and most hands, in fact, right? Also, you know, I should say that if you guys have any questions about raising a hand like 7-3 offsuit, right, which I can imagine for some people is going to be kind of difficult to justify doing because it's so weak and so kind of different. What I would say is that you should start gradually, right? Here it's interesting. I'm going to check back and call the river. I think he has a lot of gut shots and flush draws. And he's not likely to fold a better hand. I don't think I can necessarily value bet on the turn. If we get check raised, we're in a tough spot, and I think he might delay in some spots. So I'm going to check there to try and induce. And we see that he did not bluff. I mean, the ace on the river is interesting. It's a bad card to bluff in the sense that it's harder for him to represent thin value bets, right? So in that sense, it's kind of a good spot to check. But if he does bet there, then I'm more inclined to think he is bluffing because he's not value betting that thin. Tavi says here, versus passive guys, you're not getting check raised on the turn, therefore bet a lot. Yeah, yeah, of course. And it's easier for us to justify playing bet fold as well, right? But this guy is actually quite aggressive. He's check raising the turn, roughly 27% of the time. I've got a big sample on him because I've played him at other stakes. Pretty aggressive player, actually. So I think I like the decision to check back. So I've joined another table here, and we actually have position on that player who is kind of aggressive and loose as well. I've three bet pre-flop with ace jack after a raise. This is kind of, a standard value raise. It's not going to be a spot where we always know what to do post-flop, but with so many players involved, we have an equity advantage against them, and we can extract a lot of value by raising. When we check the flop, our hand is pretty well face up. We have overcards and we don't have a flush draw. This should be clear to everybody. However, we can still balance our decisions by, deciding how often we want to continue. And with so many players involved, the chance that they are trying to bluff exactly our hands is pretty small. So we've got a raise pre-flop. I'm going to defend queen 10 against the cutoff raise. Pretty dry board texture here, and he's decided to check. This is kind of interesting. Sometimes this will be a slow play, and we'll find out in a minute, I think. Yep, there it is. So when he raises, I'm just going to fold because it's pretty obvious to me, at least, that he likely has an ace. This is very exploitable to fold my queen there, but I've never really seen players take that line other ways. So on the turn here, I was getting a really good price at like 10 to 1 and decided to peel. We can see that sometimes, it's going to be a mistake. We'll see slow play flushes or trips like we see here. But still, on average, I think that I'm going to have enough of a chance to win there. Okay, so I've got a few questions in the chat. I'm going to catch up on those. We've got an isolation play from the small or from the button. I'm going to isolate 3-bet because I know this guy can be loose, and this is not exactly a value play, but I think our raise creates some fold equity. We'll be able to take some pots down post flop, and this guy's going to be loose, so his hand range is not that strong. Okay, so yeah, obviously we're going to be looking at the mathematics of different spots. Okay, so he's peeled the flop, lots of gut shots and weak pairs. I'm going to barrel the turn. This guy has donk bet, and on the 3 flush board I'm just going to fold, and I'll barrel the river for value here. It's possible that he's playing a stronger hand passive, but I don't think it's too likely. If I may suggest, it may be better for you for after the presentation to filter out some hands from Hold'em Manager. Sure, yeah, I mean, that's a great idea too. Maybe for future presentations, I'll make a point to get some of those hands put aside, and we can look at different situations, rather than just taking a really theoretical approach. And actually, most people, when they're thinking about creating hand ranges, they don't really look at the mathematics of it. They just look at a lot of good players, see what they do, and kind of use that as the correct play. But if everybody's doing that, then everybody's just kind of doing the same things, independent of whether or not it's right. But yeah, examples are very useful. And query, I think this was about my hand with Queen 10 when the guy checked back flop, raised turn. Yeah, there it is. He could have a flush draw, of course. I just don't think it's that likely. I think if he has a flush draw, most of the time he's going to bet the flop, right? My big blind hand range is going to be pretty wide. And so if he knows on this board texture I'm going to be folding a lot, right? Then he'll probably just bluff with his flush draws, right? And then sometimes take a free card if I check. which I think is probably going to be a better option. If he plays check back, right, then it's kind of giving me a free card a lot, right? Which in this case it did. I did fold to his raise, so in that sense it kind of works as a bluff if he knows that I'm going to be folding these hands. But I don't think he knows that I'll be folding those hands. So it's a bit of a leveling war. I'm not going to stab this board texture. This player seems tight. It'll give him a lot of gut shots and stuff like that. I don't think he's going to be folding often enough for me to stab with just queen high, or sorry, jack high. And I'll check the turn. Sometimes jack high is good here. We'll find out. He's thinking about it. All right. Maybe he was thinking about whether or not to value bet a 7 on the river. Kenny XX says, were you in Byron's last coaching? He discussed small blind versus big blind as well, but his approach is quite different, a lot tighter. I actually wasn't there for his coaching. I do try to make it out for anyone who has gold status. Byron Jacobs does a great job, and you guys should definitely check him out. But no, I did miss that. And, if his approach is tighter, we would definitely want to ask why, right? One of the first reasons why might be, how often does he think um, the big blind is going to continue? Like, let's say the big blind continues not 55% of the time, like we said before. Let's say he continues 75%, which is going to be a pretty solid approach. Well, against that hand range, and you'll have to kind of take my word on this because I don't have the calculator open, but we need about 40.1% equity. I've done this calculation before. And we're going to see that we end up with roughly 65% of hands, right? And this is probably, I mean, this is a lot tighter than almost everything, right? But this is a hand range we should play against a more solid opponent. I'm going to isolate here. This guy seems really tight. If he calls, he's nearly all in, so it's not a big factor. So he has called. Not too many reasons to bet here, except there's a very small chance he'll fold. And if this guy folds, it can improve our equity. I'm going to check the turn. We've got a gut shot. I've improved on the river. I'm going to put in a thin value bet and fold to a raise. And we'll see what he decides to do. Having a real think over it. Ace-6 suited, definitely going to be playing that. And I'm going to take a note here that this guy defended king 5. That ace-7 hand, or sorry, 9-7 suited, that actually might be. I don't think I really like the play there. When this guy's short stacked, it really changes things on the flop. Really does. Yeah, I need to take a closer look at that to know for sure, but I'm pretty sure that's a bad play because he's short stacked. So Kenny says again, against good players we should play tighter. Well, my assumption with these calculations was that players were equally talented, right? So I'm assuming that the big blind is as good as I am, and based on that assumption, this is how often we should play, and we can see that it's very often. I don't expect the math to convince too many people of very much. Sometimes, it takes something more than that, but I feel pretty confident that it's going to be pretty accurate. So I flop top pair and I play bet 3-bet on the flop. When this guy raises, he can have second pair. There's lots of draws here. The jack on the river improves him to lots of pairs, so I'm going to value bet. And sometimes he'll put us on a flush draw and call. So let's see here. Call big blind, king queen, raise, call down, top pair in BB. But yeah, if the opponent that we're playing is better than us, then we need to play it tighter. But it's not going to be a huge difference, right? We saw that when we looked at the effective position on how often we should play, it had an effect, but it wasn't that big, right? Even if position is twice or even five times as um, strong as it is, as I expect it to be, um, it only changes our required equity a few percent. A few percent change can mean a lot of different combos. Like let's say rather than 40% required equity, let's say we need 38%. So we'll make a 2% change. Calculate this again. Before we had a 66% hand range. This is going to be closer to 70, I think, 75. So 2% change, lots of different combos, become viable, become profitable to play. But yeah, these are still going to be small changes. Yeah, yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it. Um, Obviously, there's going to be a lot of questions about which information is correct and which information you should trust. And I try not to worry about that too much. I think in time those questions will bore themselves out. But, I invested a lot of time kind of developing this strategy, and I've used it myself for a long time. And, it works pretty well for me. Um, Queen 4 suited, this is close. I'm going to fold, but Queen 6 suited I would definitely raise, and we can sometimes adjust around that. So this guy's raised the button. We saw earlier that this guy slow played two pairs, so I think he's usually going to have a draw. But in either case, I'm going to play bet 3 bet out of position with my two pair. So I've improved to a boat. Pretty good for us. Even if he hits his draw at this point, he's probably going to lose the hand. He could have just top pair when he raises, but I still think sometimes he has draws here. Although he may have slow played in this way, like raise call flop with a straight and then raise the turn. But I think top pair is probably the most likely hand here, even though there's only a few combinations of it, just because the way he played it. Oh, queen, wow. Okay, so it's kind of a top pair type hand, made hand that's kind of marginal, but a little weaker than I was expecting. Okay, so I've raised in blind versus blind with king seven. We don't know how often for sure this guy's defending his blind, but let's say it's around 60% of the time. If he's folding 40%, then we need, I think it's like 35% equity to steal. So let's do this. Actually, let me play at least one of these two hands out. This guy knows that we're three betting him light, so he might continue aggressively. He has check raised. We have a gut shot. Our jacks and tens can sometimes be good, but not a whole lot of the time. Um, it may actually be more profitable to rebluff here, but this guy shows down a lot and he is very aggressive. He might actually come over the top, so I'm going to make a tight fold there on the turn. Um, we can't really continue on our out, so it's not that tight. But uh, yeah, he can have a lot of draws there, so it gets kind of interesting. So I flopped a gut shot, lots of draws here as well. He's decided to call, and we've improved to a king. When he plays check call, I think he can have a jack, seven, small pocket pairs are all possible. Sometimes a decent ace high, which improved on the river, but he checked, so I don't think it's too likely that he has an ace. I think he's going to lead the river pretty often with an ace in that spot. Pocket threes, I'm going to fold. With tighter players behind, I would probably raise. This guy's loose, he's going to cold call a lot, and the button is lag, he's going to three bet a lot as well. Queen 10-6 with a backdoor flush draw. We need roughly 40% equity to peel here. I think we're kind of close to that, and I'm going to make a tight fold. The Queen 10 board hits his cutoff range pretty well, but I don't exactly know how loose this guy is yet. If he's really loose, then we should be peeling with our backdoor flush draw and ace high in that spot. With sevens, I think this is standard to three bet. He seems very loose. We don't know for sure. He could have just picked up a decent run of cards, but um, now I'm starting to think that probably his call with King Queen was a bit of a slow play, or he doesn't like to three bet or four bet pre-flop. So we'll see. He's called the turn. That seems like weak showdown value. Maybe Queen Jack or Queen 10 that picked up a draw. I'm gonna barrel the river and maybe he has ace high or a small pocket pair to pay off. Queen's obviously a very strong hand. Maybe he was slow playing the flop. We're not sure. So Squad says, should PTRVC have bluffed? Well, let's go back, see which hand you might mean. So we have a three bet. I'm in position. I'm just going to call here. Um, and Jack 9 suited against the small blind raise. I think this guy's going to be pretty nitty post flop, so I'm going to three bet. So he's checked to us, which is kind of strange. I'm going to check back. And here I think I have just enough equity to peel. I'm getting almost 10 to 1. So he's betting the turn. He could have ace 10, which would be bad for us. But he could have a slow play, and some of those we beat. Not very many. Just maybe weird play with ace jack, which would be just weird. I don't think I can value bet the river either, just because I think he can play better hands this way. So I'm going to check back. Weird. Very strange. Open 3 bet, 2-2. King Jack, 9, check, Queen, bet, 5, club, 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 check. I don't think he's going to call if we bet there, but anything's possible. Yeah, Squat, I don't know which hand you mean when he should have bluffed. Was it a hand against me or against someone else? The straight board. Um, was it a four straight or just, a board with a lot of straight draws and was it against me or was it this board here? In this spot, if okay, yeah, if it is this hand, I do think he should bluff a lot here. I am going to be three betting with a lot of marginal aces and stuff like that. King high hands and Jack 10 as well. Small pocket pairs that if the board runs out kind of badly, then it can be difficult to continue. So yeah, I think it is a decent spot to bluff. Ace 8 suited, we're in early position. I think this is a standard raise. If you guys are playing tighter than this, then I would recommend that you try to gradually open up your hand range. 7-4, we're definitely going to fold there. Against the middle position range, a hand like this is probably going to have about 30% equity. It's pretty difficult for any hand to have less than 30% against a semi-laggy open raising range. But we need, over 35 to defend because our hand, it's pretty weak. It's not very playable. Hey Kev, how's it going? Yeah, thanks for the reminder. So let's just go over some stats, and let's see if I remember them all. Sometimes I forget. No, kidding. But we have VPIP, right, first stat in, then preflop raise, then we have three bet, and the next hand or the next stat over is the number of hands. The ones after that probably kind of irrelevant for our purposes. The next line down, we have raise first from early position, excuse me, from early position, then middle position, or, which includes a few different positions if you're at full ring. And then late position, which is cutoff button, small blind. This is a steal attempt. What's going on here? I totally forget what happened in this hand, but I have a flush draw, so I'm going to continue. Um, Queen on the river, no good for us. And he's barreled, and I don't really know what he has, but I think he can have a lot of different stuff. So I'm going to fold there. But yeah, okay, so steal attempt, then I have re-steal from the small blind. Then it's big blind fold to steal, small blind fold to steal, and then big blind fold versus small blind open raise. So we can see this guy's folding 18% against an open raise, defending a little over 80% of the time. I don't know if he's going to do that against everybody. Like he might defend a different amount against me or something. But that's pretty loose, and I think it's relatively appropriate. Your HUD is definitely bloated. Well, I do like stats, you know. I took a lot of stats in school, and I really enjoyed those courses. So some of it's just, you know, my kind of inner geek working its way out. I like to have a lot of stats to look at, and you know, a lot of times it just gives me information about what's already happened, right? I can't adjust my play based on these stats, but um, you know, I think it's kind of like useful. King 5-2, pretty dry board texture. We can have some questions about whether or not to raise right away. I think this board is better played call flop raise turn because I don't think he's going to have too many hands that want to do this, which is 3-bet. But now that he has, we're going to cap with our 2 pair. Um, we could even consider call and then raise, which would be okay too. The king on the river sometimes will get extra action. We'll see. If he has aces, this would make a lot of sense. Tens, wow, it's pretty aggressive on the turn. Nice to see, actually. With that in mind, we can make some adjustments. We have tens in the big blind. I'm going to play that hand. This guy's pretty laggy, so king 7-6 board, um, kind of interesting. The short stack 3-bet. I'm going to lead right out. I think we're likely ahead at this point. This guy, you know, is kind of the only player we could worry about having us beat, and he has the widest hand range at this point, so I think we're in good shape. Ace on the turn, not that great, but I don't think this guy's going to peel too often with an ace. On the river, I think he might check back with better hands than ours, maybe. So I'm going to check, although it's quite close. I think if he has queens or jacks, he's going to check. I'm surprised to see him check an ace, right? But it's also useful. We've seen him play passive up till now, so this is just another kind of case where he's played passively. Jack 8 suited, very strong hand in the small blind. Um, Pretty excited when I get a hand like this because, you know, it's kind of better than most hands you're going to be dealt. And most hands I'll probably play. So he's raised us on the flop. This could be a lot of draws. We have a made hand and a good draw ourselves. So I'm going to play bet 3-bet right away. Um, you know, there are some different ways we could play this. In particular, you know, if he has a made hand, then it's pretty likely that he's going to have us beat some of the time. You know, eights with a better kicker or a 10. It makes it harder for us to show down our eight, but I think we have just so much value with our jack high flush draw and our gut shot that it's just worth it to play aggressively. On the river, I think this is a very scary board. It's a 4 straight 3 flush, and so I think just leading out is probably the best option. 6-7 against the tight guy. I decided to raise. He's decided to raise me immediately on the flop, but I have trips. If he has fours, then we're behind, or sixes with a better kicker. But he could also have like a slow played pocket pair or something. So I'm going to play bet 3-bet again on the turn, although it's quite loose. And when he just calls, it starts to look like he may have just spewed with a flush draw. I'm going to hope that he's improved in some way, or he has an overpair that he's going to call with. So I'm just going to keep betting. Hey Kev, yeah, no problem about that. And Squat says here, why not check raise the river? Um, so I think I might have covered that while you were typing, but let's just take a closer look. So on the flop, I've got a strong draw, and I play bet 3-bet, and our opponent caps. When he does this, it starts to look like he's pretty strong, right? He could have a really strong flush draw. He could have a flop straight. He could have 2 pair or a set, right? Those become some of the more likely hands that we could expect to see. We'll see other stuff too, maybe just top pair sometimes. Um, But, okay, the turn brings a four straight, right? So anyone with a nine now has a straight, pretty bad for us, and or pretty bad for our chances of getting him to bet. And on the river, there's a three flush, which is again pretty bad for a lot of hands that he might have. Um, so I think just leading out is probably the best option. On the upper left table, I've played 6-7 suited against a cutoff raise and check raise the flop. Looks like the button slow play jacks. So I think my check raise is totally standard. When he cold calls, even though he shows up with jacks here, he's going to have a lot of different hands. Sometimes we're behind, but we're not that far behind. And, I think actually the cutoff is going to continue a decent amount, maybe 40% of the time, making kind of loose cold calls, and we're going to get value from him. This is close. I'm going to fold there just because I haven't been paying attention to the table as much as I'd like. But yeah, so I check raise with my pair and flush draw. The ace on the turn is not likely to have improved this player. If he has an ace, I think some of the time he'll check back, but it could, right? We still have our strong draws, or strong draw, and there's a ton of draws on the board that we beat. So I'm going to barrel again, and we improve on the river and just betting for value there. If he raised, I would just call because I don't think he's too likely to value raise with that many worse hands than ours. So his hand range becomes polarized between a lot of flushes that are better that are going to cap and or maybe just call and bluffs that'll most likely fold. So I raised pre-flop. This guy cold called, and we're on the flop. He's raised. Um, this guy's pretty aggressive, as we've seen. He raised with a draw and a pair earlier, so I think he can have a lot more than a queen when he does this. And I don't think there's too much value in check raising the turn. I'm just going to call down here. And sometimes I think he can play, some value hands more aggressively than he should or whatever. Obviously, this 2 is pretty bad. 3-5 got there and also the flush, but we still have a strong hand, so I'm going to pay off. And I'll just take a note that he fast played his 2 pair. Maybe I'm mixing this guy up with somebody else. Okay. So we do have a blind versus blind hand going on here. I think, unless this guy sat out after posting, but I don't think he did. So if this shows down, we'll take a look at their pre-flop play. Okay, well, it hasn't. So let's just maybe make a few guesses about what's going on. Gonna make a loose open raise there. This guy seems a little bit tight, and King 7's pretty decent. So he did raise. Got a call from the big blind. This guy's defending pretty often, right? We can see against steel raises, he's defending 65% of the time, roughly. When he plays check call flop, he can have ace highs, weak pairs, sometimes slow plays, which I think would make some sense. Also, a lot of overcard combinations like gut shots or whatever. When he check raises, it's pretty likely that if he has a made hand, it's going to be better than ours. But this is still a decent card to bluff on, so I'm going to call him down. Queen 10 on that Jack River. Of course, it's going to be one of the hands that does improve. Just luck of the draw, right? He can still have Queen Jack, which he probably value bets, or Jack 10, right? Which if he's check raising Queen 10, it would be logical for him to check raise all those other ones. And it could be flush draws. Like I said, that king on the turn is a great card for him to attack. So ace queen, standard open raise here. I think I'm going to get off this table. Good turn card for us. We're most likely ahead here. The 6 of clubs on the river, not a real concern. I expect this guy to call a lot. Unless he had some kind of a straight draw that picked up a two flush, then that flush is not too likely to give him the best hand. Although, like I said, I think this guy can make loose peels. King six on the button. This is kind of marginal, but I do like to open raise some weak kings. Gonna sit behind Donkerfield. I guess that's his name. I used to play this guy quite a bit. Um, I guess last year or so. Oh wow, that's nice. When I see players posting like this, it's pretty likely that they're just fish. Um, Sometimes they'll turn out to be somewhat talented and just not really concerned about the money, right? They just want to have fun and play poker. But a lot of the time, we're going to come to find out that these players make a lot of mistakes. 10-7, we've got a small blind raise. I think this guy's going to be raising quite a bit, even with the limper. Uh, so I intend to defend pretty wide there. Bad flop for us though, so we'll just snap fold. I'm interested to see what this guy has here though. And we'll kind of wait and see what happens. Wow. Pretty aggressive from this guy. Jack 2 still too strong to fold, in my opinion. So we picked up a gut shot on the flop, and we still have a gut shot on the turn. I'm gonna two barrel here, see what happens. He has called again, so I'm gonna three barrel. This guy's bluff last time didn't work out, and we have Jack high. I think he's going to have some hands like, if we check, it's really hard for us to play check call. So we can kind of avoid being bluffed by just bluffing ourselves. There's a lot of draws on that board, any nine. And I think sometimes he's going to fold king high and some ace highs as well. So yeah, I think bluffing is going to be a little bit more profitable. Looks like this guy just called down top pair. We'll see. No, I guess he let out. Okay. Ace three offsuit. With this loose guy behind, I'm going to fold. If it were a tighter guy, I'd probably play that. Well, it should be interesting to see how this one's played out. Again, some passive play from two pair. So yeah, so he check cold called the flop and then just called down. From his position, I would probably three bet and barrel. Although I don't mind calling and then check raising the turn, but still, his hand is quite strong, and he should not be missing so much value with two pair. King 10, I raised the limper pre-flop. This is the guy that we saw play somewhat aggressive against a raise. So we have to be aware that he might be playing kind of passive in other spots, right? Like there's a maybe important chance that he could have a 10 here or pocket sevens or eights or something. So that gives us more reasons to just value bet on the river. Of course, he can have lots of gut shots and overcards and ace high and stuff like that. Ace jack here, I'll three bet. Decent flop for us, top pair. We've got a backdoor flush draw. Running king queen would give us a straight. When this guy raises, I think he's likely to three bet with better aces than ours. So unless he has like ace five suited or pocket fives, we're probably ahead here. So I'm gonna three bet. I think a lot of times we'll see just an ace, right? Maybe ace nine, ace eight suited, something in there, and we'll barrel the river. Although that seven's not great for us either. So I open raised. and we're getting led into on the flop. I've got a couple of draws here, and there's some draws on the board. I'm going to peel one off. And on the turn, I've bricked everything. Pretty easy for this guy to continue value betting. I'm going to fold my king high there. It may seem strange to call when we don't really have good outs, right? But obviously we have some equity and some chance of being ahead. And then fold the turn when we don't improve, which we kind of expect, right? The idea here is to continue often enough on the flop that our opponent is not going to profit from donk bluffing. And then, as he continues to barrel, it becomes more expensive for him to bluff. So we can fold a certain frequency on the turn and river and still remain kind of unexploitable. That said, this is an area that I'm still working hard on doing correctly. So I expect to make some mistakes there as well. Open raise from early position. This guy's kind of short stacked. I think king queen is still going to have value three ways, so I'm going to put in that raise. He's 4-bet, which I think is going to happen a lot, which is fine. He'll have 1.5 big bets behind. Queen on the flop, pretty good for us. I think he's going to stick it in a lot of the time. I'm going to play check raise because I think it's a little bit more profitable for me. If I lead out, this guy's going to raise, and then the player behind him is likely to fold correctly a lot. If he has random 3 outers, right, 1 overcard, or even sometimes no outs, right, I think he's going to make this call on the flop, given how much he's invested already, which I could check raise, and, well, he's folded this time, but, sometimes he's again going to make a really bad call on the flop. So I feel much better playing check raise there on the flop rather than leading out. However, if there's a lot of draws, then I think leading is a better option. Then our opponent is going to raise to 2 small bets, and we can actually 3-bet in that case. Right here, when we play check raise, most of the time when he puts in his money, or because he's going to put in his money, we can't complete his raise because it's too small. So just extracting a little bit of extra thin value against a short stack. So we've been 3-bet. I think this guy's going to 3-bet a lot, but I don't think I should 4-bet. Although I think I have close to average equity with Queen Jack suited. I think my hand plays a little bit better when I just call. We've been led into. I'm going to make a tight fold here. We do have overcards, but I think this guy's going to raise a decent amount of the time. And when he does raise, it makes it very expensive for us. We have a pretty weak draw here. There's a lot of possible straights out there, or straight and flush draws, right? And those possibilities make it more likely that even if we do improve, we can be behind. So ace king, I've 3-bet this guy. He open raises a lot, check raises a lot too. We'll see what happens here. When he check raises a flop, I can see that he's winning showdowns 47% of the time. I've got a big enough sample to where that stat is somewhat relevant. So we'll see what happens. When he plays check call, I think sometimes he has weak draws. I think he's going to check raise most pairs. Although if he has just a 4 or a 6, maybe he calls. The jack on the river is pretty good. A lot of his turn peeling range will include hands with a jack. So I think he might have picked up rivered second pair and might pay us off. Ace 10, really the same story. I'm going to 3-bet this guy a lot. He plays pretty laggy, so I expect a lot of hands where I raise to be against this player when we're 3-betting. Pretty dry board texture. I don't expect better hands to fold, but I do expect some worse hands to call. So we can value bet on the turn. The queen river is interesting. When he donk bets, he is representing a queen, but I don't think he intends to see me fold. Now, that might not matter enough. We've got kind of an interesting decision here. It's really about whether or not to call or fold. We're getting 7-1, a little bit better than 7-1, so we need to win about 12% of the time. I think his flop and turn peeling range has a lot of hands in it, and we know he's loose, so I'm going to call here, thinking that he could decide to bluff on the queen river. we are getting 7-1, so basically we can lose there, 6 out of 7 times and still be in great shape. So we only need to win one and eight. So a lot of times we're going to lose there. We have to be somewhat stubborn in our decision to call this guy down light. But yeah, there's a lot of heartache in limit hold'em when you're paying off river bets. You're getting a good price, and most of the time you're going to lose. So we have 10 minutes left in the coaching for today. If you guys have any last questions, feel free to get them in. So this is interesting. We have this guy limp on the button, 4 straight board on the turn. I'm going to bet rather than check because I don't think I induced too many bluffs. The 5 straight river will just play check and probably call a bet because, I think he's probably going to bet. If he has an 8, then we're behind, but I don't think we should try to bluff or anything to bluff him off of a chop. So what happened here? We've got a raise pre-flop from this guy, and he's continuation betting. This guy we've seen be passive, but I'm getting a decent price at like 6.5 to 1 with my pair and weak backdoor draws, so I'm going to call. And he's barreled the turn. Here I'm going to make kind of a tight fold, just because this guy seems to be kind of passive. Again, this guy peeling loosely and generally playing kind of, weak and loose. So my plan here is to bet fold turn. Open raise on the button, I'll fold queens or 6-2. Pocket 8, solid hand for us in the cutoff. This will be, somewhere in the top 7% of all hands. So given that we're open raising, or at least I would be roughly 32%-ish from the cutoff, this is going to be in the upper 25% of hands that I'll play. Ace 5-2, he's going to have a lot of different hands that fold there. Some of them are going to be 6-outers, so not a bad spot for us. Ace 7 offsuit, kind of loose, but the player immediately behind me is not too likely to 3-bet me loosely. So I think I'm going to have the button some of the time. Here on the flop, I'm getting 8-1 with one player behind and marginal overcards. I'm going to make a tight fold there. I expect to have about 4 outs and would need, 10.5 to 1 to break even. And there's a lot of redraws on that board texture. So this guy's 4-bet us after open raising. I still think he can have quite a few hands when he does this, but he's pretty tight, so we'll see what happens. When he checks to me, I don't think he intends to play check fold, and I think he's going to have some aces that are better than ours, so I'm just going to check down and we'll see what happens. If I thought that he would fold better aces, then with other hands, we have an incentive to try and bluff. But when we play call flop, it's going to be pretty difficult to get a guy to fold an ace. I think he's going to call down pretty often. Although this guy seems kind of tight, so it's hard to say. We'll, could kind of wait and see. So I've been 3-bet by the button. This guy's tight and kind of standard, loose aggressive in some spots. So I've got second pair against him. I'm going to check raise for value. This is pretty thin, actually. Obviously, he can have better hands than ours, but I want to be able to check raise pretty wide against this guy with draws and top pair and over pairs even. Like I'm going to do this with aces. So my plan is to play pretty loose aggressive against him. So he's called the turn. I'm going to bet the river for value. I think he's going to pay off with 9s and 8s and sometimes looser hands as well, but I don't think he's going to call ace king there. I could be wrong about that. Ace jack, okay, I guess I am wrong. That's pretty loose. Now the reason I say that's loose is because he has blockers against a lot of the draws that he intends to beat. So basically any draw that I have on that board usually includes a jack, and he has a jack. 9-4, certainly going to fold there. This guy's raising pretty tight from the button. I think it's going to be around 40%. Whoa, 33, that's pretty tight. A 33% hand range, like I said before, that's roughly what I'm raising from the cutoff. Um, it's going to be a lot of suited aces, a lot of suited kings, king seven suited plus, I think. Um, a lot of pocket pairs like pocket fours plus, but from the button, that's a pretty tight hand range. This session has been recorded, so if you guys, haven't really, like if the small blind strategy that we covered earlier didn't really sink in, or if you have some more questions about it, um, you'll be able to have another opportunity to look at that later on. So this guy played donk bet. I'm playing call flop raise turn. I expect to be ahead of him. Um, although he can play some stronger hands more passively, but for the most part, I expect to have the best hand here. Just going to replace this table as well. So I've got two loose players here. Looks like, anyways. I'm not sure how long this table is going to survive. Against a kind of fishy guy's three bet, I like to cap a little more often than against a tight guy. Oh wow, folding immediately. That's pretty interesting. Looks like we're going to play heads up for a few minutes. Hey Reggie, where can we access this recording? Well, I'll be editing and rendering it later on today, and then I'll submit it to Poker Strategy, and they will, release it according to their schedule. I expect that you might see it next month. It is going to take a couple of weeks, but it won't be too long, and you'll be able to take a look at it. So I bet flop, bet turn, going to check back river with weak showdown value. Against his limp, I'm going to raise king six suited for value. Top pair on the flop, pretty strong. Lots of draws, so I expect to see him calling a lot. When he folds the turn, I think he probably just peeled with trash. We can see that he's kind of playing check call lines with ace high. So yeah, I think he's pretty weak there. Gut shot on the flop, king high board. Again, this is the kind of board texture we might expect to see. We might expect to see players fold a lot because he has so many trash hands. So if we see him calling a lot in those situations, then probably he's peeling wide. We've been raising a lot, so he might start to adjust and say, hey, this guy's playing like a maniac. His adjustment, it appears, is to quit. So I guess I'll get off this table. And we're all out of time for today. Just a minute left, so I'm not going to join a new table. We'll sit out after this orbit. But I'll be back tomorrow for the basic coaching. And I'll be back next week as well for the advanced at the same time. And I know that we covered quite a lot of content. Okay, yeah, see you later, Kenny. You're very welcome. Yeah, I know, yeah, we covered a lot of content today. But, hopefully you guys have learned a little bit about open racing strategy and the way that we justify our decisions when we're deciding whether or not to enter the pot. Myself, I like to put a lot of emphasis on being able to really justify your play and say, this is why I'm doing it. There's a lot of spots in poker where that's not easy to do. But really, until you can justify your play, until you can say, this is why I'm making the decision that I'm making, then it's going to be way too easy for there to be like random variance in your decisions, right? Like we're just clicking buttons here, right? Raise, fold, call, whatever. I have three buttons in front of me. So the chance that I make a decision correctly just by pure luck, right, is like 33% on one decision, right? So if you can't explain why you're making that play, right, then it's too easy to just disregard it. Or it's too easy to say, look, you know, I shouldn't feel too strongly about my decision because I don't know why I made it, right? So there can be a lot of uncertainty that you're allowing to creep into your play because you don't know why you're doing something. And, you know, for myself, I see that as a real problem. All right, guys, so we'll wrap it up there. Thanks a lot for the questions and for the comments. And hopefully this won't be up in too long. You'll be able to take a look at it. However, when it is made available, I will post in the feedback thread, which is listed in the coaching info. I'll post in there so you guys know, right? Could take a little while, easy to forget about. Why even bother thinking about it? I'll post it for you guys. So that's all I've got for today. Take care, guys, and I'll see you hopefully next week. Cheers.